Welcome, everybody, to the Comedy Masterclass. I'm Ted Alexandro, your host, and with me is my dear friend and one of the greats, a man who I'm not going to say has hit his stride because the stride has been there for quite a while now. But it's great to see when one of your peers is in the zone and owning his voice and owning his story the way my friend Gary Gulman has. Gary, welcome to the Masterclass. You are truly a master. And thanks for making time to be with us.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'll use any excuse to spend time talking to you. I want to say that you have always been, since the days of when I first watched you at the comic strip. When I first started to visit New York from Boston, you were someone I really admired and inspired me. And also, it was important to have a few guys who were doing stuff that wasn't gratuitously edgy and basically just cruel and awful. It was nice to see, because at that time in New York, it was just everyone trying to sound just like Attell.
That's true. Thanks, buddy. Yeah. There was no lack of cruelty on the comedy scene when we came up. Well, thank you for that. I wanted to kind of, in a way, start at the beginning and juxtapose it with now and kind of fill in the gaps in between. But I wanted to, since this is a masterclass and the people that we're talking to are, all over the map, but I wanted to get a window into maybe what a week looked like for Gary Gulman when you were starting out as a comedian. How did you kind of map out those early weeks and maybe even days? Like how did you chart that path of those early weeks? I want to be a comedian. I am a comedian. Even convincing yourself. What did those early weeks look like for you?
That's an amazing question, Ted, that in 30 years of comedy, nobody has ever bothered to ask. And it's so important, because I was always curious about what comedians were doing day to day. And for me, I just had this thing where I would go to rooms and clubs that had a show, and I would ask the host or whoever was in charge, can I do 5 minutes? And most of the times they would say, hang out, we'll see. Sometimes they would say no, and that was fine too. I didn't mind that. And then my rule was, if I didn't get on stage, I would have to go home and write. And so I would just take things, and when I look back on them, they were things such as I thought it was really funny that a woman I worked with at TJ Maxx had a charm that said Vinny's Babe on it.
I remember her.
Vinny's Babe. So I was like, oh, it's gold. I have to make a joke about this one.
Was it literally gold?
It was literally gold too. And I was like, I have to make a joke about TJ Maxx. And let me tell you something. It always got a laugh. I look back on it now and I cringe. I'm like, who are you to be so judgmental? And also it was one of those. This was a great formula starting off in comedy. The you never see formula.
You never see this.
You never see. So you see this.
You see this.
Another nationality or group, and you never see that. And so the punchline was, you never see an elderly Jewish woman with a charm around her necklace that says Murray's bitch, and it would murder. And now I look back on it, they're laughing because you said bitch and you said Murray, and it's just this easy joke, but it was those types of jokes that would keep you going early on.
I can't believe you threw that. I can't believe you threw that away. That's a killer now.
By the way, it would murder. It would murder if I did it in certain clubs.
Hey guys, I wanted to talk to you about Crowd Health. We all know healthcare in the United States is broken and wasteful. I was very excited to discover Crowd Health, which offers a community-based alternative by crowdfunding healthcare. I get to avoid traditional insurance fees and support real people instead of mega bloated corporations. It's a more humane and cost-effective approach to healthcare. Please check out the link in my show notes to get a discount on your first 3 months with Crowd Health.
I always used to say that I am only limited by my stage time in terms of improvement. The more stage time I get, and if there's ever a time when I can sort of call my shots in a sense, say I want to go on there and then just show up, that I'll be unstoppable. So it was really negotiating early on the lack of stage time with the amount of time I had to write and try out things. And I always suspected that I would be able to outwork most of the comedians because, and that was obvious pretty quickly on that these guys were not industrious. They were not all that hardworking. So that was the thing. I said, I'm not nearly as natural and funny as a lot of these people, and just are so funny. And I also was thinking about this in terms of comedy now, and it's that if you do one thing really well, and there are a dozen things you can do as a comedian. You can write, you can perform, you can do voices and all these things. If you don't do one thing really well, you can really stand out. For some people, it's their commitment. For some people, it's their writing. For some people, it's that they'll say anything. And so I said, I'll be a worker and a writer because I don't feel all that comfortable on stage. So those were sort of the early ideas and things that I was concentrating on day to day as I first started out. And I would make a lot of calls, but I don't know if this is still something that happens now, but it was a lot of hanging out. Did you find that too, that you would just hang out at the club and hope somebody would not show or be late and you could get some extra time? Or a lot of the hosts were just really generous and kind and were not hoarding their own stage time and would give you 5 minutes. There were a lot of really generous guys. There was one particular man who passed away named Rich Seisler, who had a Wednesday night at the Kowloon in Saugus, Massachusetts, the Knicks Comedy Club there. He would put me on. And then Paul D'Angelo, who was one of my first friends in comedy, whenever he had a show, he would let me do 5 minutes either to open or if he was hosting a show. So there were some really generous mentors who saw nothing in me more than I was nice and I seemed to be working hard. There was not a lot of, I didn't have chops and my jokes were very, very weak.
Well, you make a couple of points that jump out at me, great points about in the beginning showing up.
Yes.
I always say to young comics, and you essentially made the same point. If you want this to be your job, you have to treat it as such. You have to show up to the office, and there is no office other than you have to create what your office looks like. I mean, obviously, it's going to look like a club or some sort of stage, but it's also going to look like where do you go to write? So. Yes. The point that you made about showing up, and that's what I did. And in a sense, you were almost more audacious than I was because
Hold on 1 second. I'm really sorry, Ted.
No problem. No problem.
The door.
Lunchtime.
Hey, thank you.
We're going to keep this in. I'm not editing.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay, buddy. It's perfect.
I think my wife miscommunicated with the delivery, so I'm gonna.
It happens.
I'm gonna text her.
Yeah. I'll just keep talking because you can do both. I think for both of us coming up in thriving scenes that we're not that dissimilar, New York and Boston, and the outskirts, because I was doing rooms on Long Island, New Jersey, the outer boroughs, But New York and Boston, just showing up was edifying. And, but what I was going to say is I was not as audacious as you as asking for stage time. I would go to the cellar or wherever, and I would just say, I'm a comic, and hope that they didn't like call me out on that. Like, no, you're not, because I was still trying to convince myself that I was. I'd say I'm a comic is okay if I sit in the back. And 9 times out of 10, and unless the place is so overflowing, they'd let you do that. So in the early going, I would just go and hang out and watch. So yeah, to your point, I would hang out a bunch. And then the places where I started to make connections, where I knew maybe the MC, and it only takes one guy. You gave a couple of names, and every comic has them, of mentors who take a liking to you, can see that you're earnest about wanting to be a comedian, wanting to get on stage. So yeah, on Long Island initially, there were a couple of guys. Funny story, just to make it quick. I showed up at Governor's on Long Island, and Peter Bales was the host every Tuesday for the open mic, and I went for like 5 weeks and kept signing my name, and he never put me up. So then the 6th week, I went and said, "Hi, I'm Ted Alexandro. I've been signing up for 5 weeks now." And he's like, "Oh, you should have told me sooner. I'm so sorry." Those guys have so many things and people coming at them. So I just sat there for 5 weeks, and then he put me up the 6th week. But that was not wasted time. I was learning, and I had a good set. And then he knew me. He remembered me. So
totally,
just kind of asserting yourself a little, which I probably could have done sooner. But it's not wasted time.
I remember seeing Jerry Maguire, and there's that. I forget who says it. Probably Jay Moore says, "It's not show friends, it's show business." And it's not true.
That's a great point.
It's show friends.
That's a great point.
I mean, everything to my recurring role on Amy Schumer's Life and Beth is because it came from a friend. And I'm sure if I hadn't studied acting extensively, I wouldn't have done well enough in the audition. But still, the fact that I'm sure I got pushed to the front of the line happened to do with the fact that I've been friends with Amy since I met her at the Comedy Cellar. So there are a few incredibly talented assholes who can avoid real connections, but they're few and far between. And if you think you might not be one, you're not one. So I really think that some of the best advice, and it was maybe the second show I had ever done at Nick's Comedy Stop, I would ask comedians for advice to give to a new comedian. I remember this one guy, and his name will come to me. He said, "Most of your work will come from other comedians, and you spend enough time at these clubs, they become your friends, and you notice over the years that you see guys who they're not ready and they're getting more work, but they're really good to hang around with." So I don't think, and I'm not saying to curry favor or be fawning over anybody, but people generally like to work with people who are nice and encouraging. So I think that's some of the best advice I got. I would put it in the top 10.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. The people that you start with, the people that you come up with, the people that you're doing hell gigs with, open mics, you're just performing for each other. You don't realize it at the time, but if you stay in the game, those are going to be your cherished friends 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah. And the other thing is I find it helpful to review that idea of it being show friends even as you get older, because I mean the Amy Schumer situation is a great case in point. There were a lot of people when I was beginning who some of the older comedians didn't want to bother with any of the young comedians.
Sure.
They didn't want to help out. They didn't want to be encouraging. They wanted to go out of their way to make it a difficult journey. And those are the type of people who are sacrificing friendships with younger people and the very rewarding friendships, both in terms of kindness and encouragement, but also cynically work. You're missing out on work. There are guys who you would not want to work with because they were so shitty to you, and they haven't really changed.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's the old adage about the people on the way up and the people on the way down, and you're going to cross paths.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's not even a cynical thing. It's just like, how about not being an asshole, and how about being kind? Yes. And that might come back 15 years later, like you said, with a plum gig. I want to juxtapose what we just delved into, like those early weeks, with now. What does probably 30 years in or thereabouts, what does a week look like for Gary Gulman now that you are accomplished and you know what you're doing? You have command of all of your tools, and holistically, you have command, presumably, of your life in ways that you didn't back then, and relationships and a long-term love relationship, all of the things that inform your craft and your life, and being healthy and happy, and knowing how to do what you set out to do now. What just to juxtapose now, what does a week look like for you as a comedian?
I mean, I'll give you a day on which I had a show, because there are some days if I don't have a show, it's not as fun. So I think Sunday night I had a show. Monday night I had a show that was just mine. And so I spent an hour and a half or so playing basketball in the morning. And then the Sade's opening for
Hey,
Sade, do you mind if I share you with Ted?
Hi, Sade. What are you're eating?
Yeah, I just had some food.
I'm jealous.
Sorry.
That's okay.
All right. So then I wrote for a while in the apartment, and then I was like, it was a really nice day. I said, I'm going to go outside to write. And then
talk a little bit about that. Why the change of scenery?
Because you can get distracted easier in your home than you can outside. And also, an hour is a good amount of time to spend working straight without a break. And then there's not a writer who works really well who doesn't do a lot of walking, I've found. It seems to be part. I remember there was like this Latin phrase that I couldn't memorize or pronounce right. It had the word something ambulatory, whatever it was. And I was like, oh, all these writers take long walks. And I find that a shower and a long walk, or when I used to do long distance running, was so helpful to feeding the juice or stirring up the juice. So then I went on this long walk, and I got to a coffee shop, and then they kicked me out about an hour and a half in to close at 4, which is ridiculous.
Oh, okay, so it didn't have to do with how much you had purchased or not purchased. It was it was closing time.
Yeah, it was closing time, but they closed at 4.
Oh.
And then I wrote outside my building, and then I draw up a set list for that night, and it's all new stuff because I'm touring a new hour starting in the fall. So I write up that set list, which is enormous, because the thing that the comedian spends most time kicking himself is, oh, I wish I had tried that new bit. I wish I had tried that line. And it's like, and when you're not getting on stage, when you're new, it's even worse. But when you get old, it's like, I had a new idea and I have all this stage time. What am I doing? And so then I did the show, and then the best time to write really is right after a show. So you want to write down what worked, especially the sentences or phrases that you're like, I have to repeat this, because I record all my sets and I listen to them not enough. But if you can write down that sentence that is still making you think, oh, that was good, that phrase, that wording, that approach, that perspective after a show. That's when you're most confident. You've got some adrenaline, and you want it to. I always say, stop, keep writing until the coffee dies down. Just before the coffee stops telling you what a genius you are, keep writing.
That's such a great point. It almost reminds me of athletes who lift after a game. You know, I always say to myself, like, why would you work out? Like, the game is it. Like, why would you? But it's true. Like, I often find in a cab or on a train after, like, your brain is still locked into that zone and you're thinking that way. And lines are occurring to you, taglines, topics, or maybe just veering off into some other area that's related. So, yeah, that's such a great point about, you know, we're constantly trying to get into that zone, right? So when you're there, and that's something I remind myself of too, even if it's 3 a.m. and you can't sleep, it's like, now is sit down and write, because your brain is trying to tell you, like, you're ready.
Yeah, I really find it the best analogy I can come up with, and it'll date me, but you'll understand it, is after a show, you're turning from the Incredible Hulk back into Bill Bixby.
That's the perfect analogy.
There are those moments where you're still kind of the Incredible Hulk, and you want to make your analysis and your adjustments and record some of the feelings you had while you were the Hulk.
Before you turn back into Eddie's father?
Before you turn back into Bixby, who was the poor guy. He couldn't get out of his own way. He was so sad and sullen, and just the world was kicking his ass.
Right. No, that's such a great point about, just remembering that the job does not end when you get off stage. You know, that in a sense, do you do that at the venue, or do you do that like when you get home or get into a cab? Like, when do you do this work post show? Does it vary?
The best situation is that if you do the Vintage Room at Gotham Comedy Club, right across the hall is the green room. And so when I was working out my last special after the show, I would go into the green room for a half hour, an hour, and take notes on what I just said, the set list, and where I had made adjustments or wavered. And invariably in that case, when you're preparing for a special, it's like, oh, I have to say this that I didn't say tonight because I only get 2 shots at that. But I think, and I'm just saying this because it reminds me of something, and again, we'll be on the same wavelength in terms of our age, but it's very easy to get discouraged in show friends, but part of it is because they make it seem like you only got 1 shot. And it was B Rabbit in 8 Mile who sort of solidified this idea that you only get 1 shot. But if you remember from 8 Mile, he gets 2 shots. He gets a few shots. And so you may think you only get 1 shot in this business. I've gotten hundreds of shots. The good news is you get hundreds of shots. The bad news is 1 shot, even if it goes well, is not going to give you a career. It will give you the thing that leads to the thing that leads to you maybe getting a sniff. There are very few examples of outside of Freddie Prinze and Roseanne getting 1 shot and everything. There were things that led to their 1 shot that are hard to discount, but
the perspective that you gain from having been in the business decades really can alter your whole life, but your work habits and all of that. And that kind of pressure that, 1 shot, if we only got 1 shot, there wouldn't be a comedian working, like everybody would be out.
Yes.
I wanted to talk to you about inspiration outside of comedy, because obviously we're inundated with it. We watch it. We grew up watching it. We're fans. We're really deep into the study of people we love. I want to go outside. Could you name a couple of a handful of artists that are not comedians per se, but maybe whatever field they're in, but people that are maybe go-tos for you to kind of rejuvenate or maybe nourish that creative fire when you want to maybe step away from comedy even?
Well, I mean, it's sad when you say if you want to step away from comedy, but I don't think it's that sad, because there are times every day when I want to kind of luxuriate in what we get to do and how we get to think of jokes and ideas, and I'm usually just at longest a week away from my next chance to do it in front of an audience. So I remember recently hearing somebody complain about how the fact that they're looking at everything through a comedian's eyes, and I don't look at everything through a comedian's eyes.
Was it Seinfeld? I heard Seinfeld talk about, like, I'm constantly, everything is.
And he was saying it like it was a burden, and it's not a burden unless you think that I guess what I'm saying is, I think everybody is aware of things that go on and irritate them, and I think we might be more sensitive than the average person. But unlike most people who get cut in line, say at Trader Joe's, I get this incredible opportunity to not only exact revenge, but connect with a giant group of people, and it's not, to me, a burden. But then you look at his output since 1998, and it's like, oh, this is a man who is not finding any joy in the writing, because I don't know what he's putting in those yellow legal pads, but my word, it's not that hard to write an hour. It is not, especially when you can get on stage whenever you want to. When we started, they made it seem like, oh, if you get 2 or 3 minutes a year, you're doing a great job. No, it's it's
the work. It's the work.
It's putting in the work, and also I don't know what this guy is doing, that he's only put out maybe 30 new minutes since he said I'm telling you for the last time, and yet he still does the Beacon every couple of weeks.
He must be telling us some of the same things. but I agree with you, but maybe I didn't phrase my question properly.
I think I can answer what we can make use of. In that I will draw inspiration from any artist, athlete, person who does a job that has nothing to do with art ostensibly, although I think philosophically you can find art in any job. But for instance, I'll never forget this, because it was so minute, almost the definition of minute. But it's Edward Hopper, right? He wrote Nighthawks.
Yes.
There was this painting I saw at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there was this white splotch on a lamppost, and I remember thinking, he didn't just throw that in on a whim. He considered that, and he knew what he was doing, and he intended it. And I thought, what a great example of specificity and detail, and it inspired me to say, and this was it combined with this interview I heard with it was actually a documentary called Wings for Wheels. I think it was Bruce Springsteen talking about what went into making Born to Run, the album, and over and over again, from every angle, it was clear that he went over every instrument and every note of every instrument within every beat of that song, of that album.
The whole album,
not just the song Born to Run, that entire album. And I thought, I couldn't do that. I don't have the attention span and the obsession, and I get overwhelmed and discouraged, and maybe I could do it once I started, but I would put it off for so long that it would never come out. But I can go over every word in my jokes. They're not that long, and obviously I'm not going over the articles and the conjunctions, but there are words in your set that you're like, this is not doing enough work, or this is in the area. Is this the best word? Is this the funniest word? Is this the word that is least likely to occur to the person listening? And because the audience is very sharp, they're trying to come up with the punchlines while you're coming up with it. And
Sure.
very rarely do you come up with what the comedian is going to say and still laugh. It is very rare. You usually want a twist, a surprise ending. So those two things were really important at a really important time in my comedy, which is to say I was 40 years old and I had 3 roommates, and I think I had just started dating Sade. I was broke. I was near bankruptcy, and the one thing was that I had put in a lot of years in comedy, and it was sort of this thing where
you were ready. You were ready.
The hard part is over.
Yeah.
I've built this foundation, and now let's try to make it more unusual and more original. And that's sort of how I developed my voice, or expanded, amplified. It was just, there were hints at it, but then that period where I couldn't go out on the road that much because I didn't have a big enough name. So I was just grinding in the city, making my rent off of city spots, which how hard that is.
Yeah.
And then an occasional road date in which I wouldn't waste a moment. From the time I landed, I wasn't staying up late drinking after the shows. I was going home, so either I could get up early the next day and write, or do some writing before I went to bed. It was a critical time.
That's a great kind of lesson for people too, who may presume that show friends or show business is partying and hanging out and drinking, and there are times for that too. But what you're talking about is that commitment of no wasted time. You have to really lock in those opportunities. And like you said, at that point in your life, you knew how to work. You had the habits, you had the chops, you knew how to get the results, you had your voice. So yeah, that's so important. And I know it even more now, married with kids. You really have to seize those opportunities to work when they're presented to you.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was Don Gavin from Boston, and I know that another comedian, Tony V, had said this, and then Colin Quinn is a great example of this. They just said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing because they each said it differently, but this is such a great art form where you can improve as long as you're coherent. You can improve at it, and you do improve at it, and you may not get the breaks that the young people get, and that's fine, but you will continue to get better at this thing. I mean, Colin's shown into his 60s. Carlin got better into his 70s. I mean, it's just we're really lucky, because when you think about, I remember seeing a quiz show in which that guy Charles Van Doren laments that the great physicists are over the hill by the time they're 25, and the novelists are their peak is in their 30s or whatever, and the athletes, even Tom Brady, by the time he's 45, it's too late to improve, really. And so we're really fortunate. And the other thing that I heard early on was it's a marathon, not a sprint, and it's not even a marathon, it's an ultra marathon. It's I mean, I feel like we're into this.
It's torture.
Yeah, the 60th mile. And it is torture. Everything but the writing and performing is torture. It's just that the performing can be so fun that it makes you want to put aside your differences with everything else to keep doing it.
And isn't that what draws us all to it, and audience members too, sitting there, is how easy and fun that looks, right?
Yeah.
When someone's in their element and killing, it looks easy and fun. But as you pointed to, so many hours, years of work go into that, and decisions to utilize your time well, because it looks effortless. And when you were talking about Bruce Springsteen and the attention to detail, I think there are times for that, but there are also times for breathing and seeing what happens and allowing things to happen on stage, and allowing yourself the freedom to not to fail. I don't like that word necessarily, but to take risks. And I'm not saying that Bruce Springsteen doesn't, because I'm sure like when they play live, they do different versions, but he was talking about the studio version and getting that right. But I think with time and experience, your process grows, and what you allow yourself to do grows, and probably even what you look at as failure and bombing, right? Because that's the fear, like, oh God, if there's not a laugh, or if it's quiet, or you start to learn like not to panic moment to moment, and to take risks, because it's important to do that. It's always important to do that in the moment, but also in terms of your life and the things we're talking about, how you structure your day, how you structure your week. Take risks and don't remain in stasis.
I think that is really important as the attention to detail, the idea of risking. And it reminds me of a few things. I remember Attell saying you need two types of places: a place where you can kill and a place where you can bomb, a place where you can experiment. And I feel like there are things you can learn. I just saw an interview with Ed Sheeran, and he was saying you never learn anything from success, which is, there's something to that. Most of your big mistakes became something that you learned a great lesson from and made adjustments. And sometimes mistakes can lead to an improvisation that is just out of this world. But the thing you can learn from success is, oh, I'm good at this, and I should be confident about this. And also this idea that I figure things out. I didn't think I could do 100 things. I didn't think I could ever learn to tie my shoes. And I look back and I say, oh, that used to be a thing. Now I have a stylish way to do it. But I think that making mistakes is so helpful, and also not punishing yourself afterwards. Like that was the biggest hurdle I had to get over in terms of maintaining my mental health as a professional comedian, which was I would attach my self-esteem to how I did in a show. And
even in real time, right? Because sometimes you lash out at the crowd because they're not matching what you expect, or it's not going the way you expect. So it's not even like, sometimes you beat yourself up after. But I think those moments where you see comedians lose it, they're essentially beating themselves up in the moment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that allowing myself to bomb and seeing it as just part of the process, and okay, that joke that I tried, that I had set my heart on, the joke that was going to make the leap from club to theater, it bombed, and I worked so hard on it. And I think, no, hey, you did this thing where you tried really hard, you worked on it, you were prepared, and it didn't go well, and let's try another different thing that may fail, and it's been co-opted by tech bros, but there's this old saying by Samuel Beckett about fail better. Like it's ever tried, ever failed, no matter, fail again, fail better. And that it's been taken by dildos, but I think it's still applicable to life. And I think it's real.
Well, the phones keep getting better. The computers keep getting better. So let's not be too.
It's some real wisdom, and it was so important for me to be able to perform and not be worried about bombing, because if I bombed years ago, it would ruin that night, the next morning.
Oh, you better believe it.
And until I got on stage again and reproved myself and filled the bucket back up again, I was not myself. And it's just, it's ridiculous. You have to have kind of a short memory, almost like a baseball hitter, where it doesn't matter what you did last time at bat. So
that's earned too. You know, that's earned over time, because in essence, you don't have the experience or the tools to turn the page, or to even within the course of a set to self-correct or not self-sabotage, or just go with it, or you have different tools over 20, 30 years that you didn't have in the first 5 or 10. So yeah, all of that, you know, you're equipped to be kinder to yourself, to enjoy even a joke that doesn't do well, you know. So yeah, it is funny the tools you accumulate that make you a better comedian and a healthier person.
Yes. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about success, because you have enjoyed probably your biggest wave of commercial success. I mean, you've always been one of the best of our group. But I wanted to talk about what it has felt like for you. I guess you've had some time and perspective, and I know you just shot another special. So maybe going from the Great Depress, did that feel like a culmination for you? Did that feel like a moment? Like I'm clicking on all cylinders, like it's all coalescing. I'm reaching, I know I'm aware that I'm reaching another point. What did all of that feel like? The success, the kind of stamping of Gary Gulman, it has arrived in the larger sense. And then if you would, going to the next, because then you like what's next is always the question. So how did that feel for you, arriving there and then starting to build this next one?
Yeah, I mean, it was exhilarating, because and one thing that was really helpful along the way, and by the way, none of my stick-to-itiveness and what's another word? I don't want to use the word grit.
Perseverance.
My determination is not unwavering. There were months where I quit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And leading up to the Great Depress.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few months where I had just been hospitalized for just a debilitating case of major depressive disorder and anxiety. I was in the psych ward for several weeks, and then not on the road for many weeks.
Well, and at least you had a good reason.
Yeah.
You're going to quit.
And part of my decision making going on then was whether I can manage my mental health while doing this thing that can be very discouraging and also not always provide me with health insurance. And so I was really on the brink in terms of things, and there was some idea that, well, maybe my particular makeup can't handle the vicissitudes of stand-up comedy life as a 45-year-old man, and it was all very depressive thinking. but
Mm-hmm.
it was reasonable because I was depressed. So it superseded any kind of logic or thoughtfulness. Anyhow, over the years, there have been weeks, never that long, where I was like, "Oh, I don't do this anymore. You can take your job and shove it, comedy." And then
who do I say this to exactly? Who's the boss? Yeah.
So the good thing is that you can't quit because there's nobody to quit to. There's not a boss. So people will occasionally still call you and say, "I got a show," and
they don't know that you've quit.
You can't turn it down.
That's really funny. That's really funny.
There were so many times where I just did gigs after I had quit, and I was like, you know what? I don't have to make a living at this. I just love it, and it's Al Pacino. Every time I try to get out, they pull me back in.
That's really funny.
So many things in life, but
yeah.
Okay, so I do the special, and it's just this culmination of 2.5 decades of ultimately not quitting.
Mm-hmm.
And here was the thing, though. My success, as defined when I was 28 or 23 when I first started, had to change because it had passed me by. I didn't become a TV sitcom lead, which was the only way you could get stage time, it seemed like, or headline coast to coast, was to become the lead in a sitcom when I first started. And it was right. That seemed to be the only way, or to have been an 80s comedy club star.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So it was very daunting. And anyhow, so that was how I defined success early on. And then by the time I shot the Depress or started performing it at clubs and small theaters and rock clubs and bars and whatnot, anywhere I could to practice it,
mm-hmm.
my success had to be, even if it doesn't get picked up by a streamer, hopefully HBO, that was my goal at the time. I'll at least make the people who see this feel a little bit better if they have depression, and also they will feel, if they know somebody with depression, they'll understand it a little bit better. So you
weren't even thinking in terms of, this is going to be a phenomenon, I'm on HBO. Like you were like, I'm happy with this work, and hopefully some people will see it and help. Yeah. It was still kind of. Yeah,
that was my dream was HBO, because I knew it was the perfect showcase for it. But I had to divorce myself from the outcomes, because the outcomes had attaching my psyche, my self-esteem to the outcomes had brought me to the Great Depress. I used to ask friends, I would say, do you think I'm a failure? And I look back on it now, and I was like, how could you consider yourself a failure? You were doing this thing that you had dreamed of since you were a kid. You had just made a success be this thing that is like, I didn't win the lottery, so I'm a failure. It's just absurd. So I remember writing it down. I said, as long as I do this show and people hear it, and without exception, after a show, at least one person will say, this really made me feel better, or made me understand what my brother, father, cousin, mother is going through. That became the thing. And then listen, I would have licked my wounds for 72 hours if HBO had said no thank you, and I just kept touring it. But I would have survived, and I wouldn't have let it embitter me or make me stop. If anything, I think it was maybe not the length of it, but the extreme of that depression was necessary in order for me to reorder my priorities and my thinking and my relationship with myself and with comedy. So
and I'm guessing that better enabled you to enjoy when that moment happened. You must have been in a, I would think, in a good place to welcome it.
Yes, I mean, it sounds too new agey, and all these things about how when you need a teacher, God sends a pedagogue or whatever these things, and one door opens, another door closes, and I do think the universe is working in some way to help us evolve, but I don't know if it's so bent on sorcery and superstition. But I will say that I think that in order for me to do this work, I had to divorce myself from the outcome. I know I just said that, but I'm trying to get I don't think I wouldn't have been able to enjoy it, because I would have said, well, what can this lead to? Instead of the whole journey is what this leads to, being able to do what I love and what I'm passionate about and brings me joy and spreads joy. I think is really the answer. And
did that feel like the first time that was really resonating in you in a real way? Like that was a departure? In the past, it was always like, like this has got to be the thing, or so
be the thing. And that's what led to my breakdown. My last special, I was convinced, was the best work I could ever do, and it didn't sell, and it broke my heart, and it contributed to this extended 2.5 year just debilitating, sitting on the couch like Silas Marner. What is that word for that thing where you it's not comatose, but it's you're alive, but you're just, it was, anyhow, it'll come to
a comedian. Let me get that straight. So your last one, you thought it was your best work, and clicking on all cylinders, and nobody bought the special.
No.
Amazing,
no.
Right?
Nobody bought it, and I was just like, this was supposed to be the thing that would get me to a level where I could sell enough tickets to get invited back to places and make a living. Luckily I was never a person who needed money to feel successful, because that's a whole other thing. I just wanted to be able to have insurance and pay my rent and not be consumed with anxiety over how I was going to do those things. I'm not luckily a materialistic person, and my wife is not a materialistic person. So I was not trying to live a high life, which is one of these things that I always say, keep your overhead low, because it'll make you make choices that are just really, really bad for an artist. Just you'll sacrifice your integrity because you have a payment on a Lexus or something like that. So never
a necklace that says Vinny's bitch.
Yeah. So anyhow, the other thing that the Great Depress kind of solved was this very silly, superstitious type thing that I had, where in high school in 12th grade, I caught the ball on the 3 and on the 3-yard line, our own the defender's 3-yard line, and reached for the goal line as I was tackled, and somebody knocked it out of my hand before I got it in, and I was convinced that this was a metaphor for my life, that I would always get very close and then blow it at the end. And then when the Great Depress went well, because here's the thing about the last special, is as great as I thought the material was, I was convinced that I didn't perform it best, and maybe something was missing, because otherwise it would have sold. So I was convinced that I'd fumbled on the goal line once more, and so the Great Depression, I was like, okay, I didn't choke when it came right down to it. And then the one thing that was very strange in developing that special was that, and I think, again, this may sound new agey, but I think there's something to it. And while I don't think anything should be easy necessarily for it to be worthwhile or anything like that, there was sort of a thing where it felt almost like I didn't have to fight a lot. I didn't have to meet a lot of different people to direct it. I didn't have to spend a lot of time convincing a number of different platforms to put it up. It just seemed to be something that everybody got and sort of I got out of the way of it and embraced it. And I don't think that has to happen with everything, but I don't think you should be suspicious of things that come that way. And also I think that you also kind of earn them in how you treat people, because there are more people who want to work with you if you have a reputation as that, because they're doing their diligence more than ever before they decide to work with you nowadays. And I think that's what makes it sometimes feel so blessed, is that you've behaved a certain way, and now there are people who are willing and excited about working with us.
Yeah. That it almost makes you wonder if there should be an addendum to that: God opening, closing one door and opening another. Like sometimes God opens like a few doors open it, like God will open several doors.
Yeah. If you obey the speed limit in New York City, you can drive from like 57th Street to, I'm not exaggerating, 110th with all green lights.
Yeah,
I've done it a couple of times, and it's not a perfect analogy.
That's a religious experience. No, for sure.
It's a strong analogy.
Yes. Let me just because we said we'll keep it close to an hour.
I'm happy to talk jokes and comedy for the rest of the day, so there's no rush. But I know that people generally like to listen to things for about an hour.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll ease into the wrap up portion. But then I just wanted to kind of transition to you have this this moment, and those of us in the business see it and celebrate it and recognize it. Like Gary's there. Gary's like, it's almost hard to describe, but just that Gary has distilled his essence, and people can see and appreciate not just his comedy, but him. Like this special has distilled that. So then, whether you felt that or not, maybe you did to some degree, maybe you would or wouldn't articulate it that way, but then it's on to the next thing. So the special that you just shot, how did you deal with the inner expectations, or how did you free yourself from them? What was the mental process coming off a success versus coming off that last special where nobody bought it? Like how do you deal with success?
Oh, there was one thing that I wanted to mention before I moved on to the success, and it was this thing I keep on my phone in a picture I took of a foreword to a book that Kurt Vonnegut wrote, in which I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but I'm happy to text it to you later, in which he says that after, and I'm not comparing my special to this, but after he got a book that was popular, and it was either Cat's Cradle or Slaughterhouse-Five, but he was able to he said he had survivor's guilt. And he said it was similar to the survivor's guilt he had after surviving the Battle of the Bulge and the Dresden fire bombing. And he said, and I feel this way 100%. And I think if you're a thoughtful and humble artist and you don't feel this way, then shame on you. He said, I have this survivor guilt because there are so many writers and painters, and he said comedians, and that's what really blew me away, because most people ignore comedians, but he said writers and painters and actors and comedians, and he said who the audience has failed, and they did not find an audience. And he says there is no substitute, basically paraphrasing of course, there's no substitute for luck. I got very lucky with the timing of a lot of these things, and so I'm very grateful for that. But I would be lying if I thought, it was a culmination of all my hard work and expertise. No, it was some really terrific timing, and this point where not everybody was as open about being hospitalized and things like that. There were other comedians who talked about it, but there weren't so many that it was like, another guy talking about his hospitalization, which I imagine in 3 years, that'll be the that'll be the case. Hopefully, so many people have talked about it that'll become.
My new special is all about that.
Yeah, so it's just like this incredible timing, and I was very lucky because normally they don't put 48-year-old comedians on TV for the first time on special. HBO doesn't do that, so I was very fortunate that it got through. But the thing about the success is, and this will be the only big name I'll drop, because I mean you know this guy, and I think you can attest that he's a really thoughtful guy. Judd Apatow was the executive producer of the special, and was I mean so helpful in a number of ways, including just bringing it to HBO and saying I want to present this. But he called me the day after the special aired, and I had been doing 3 weeks of promotion and got to panel with Conan and Seth Meyers, and it was all very exciting. And did
first time paneling with those guys.
Yeah, and
before that, it was always like doing stand up.
You do the show and then you go home, and that was very nice. I loved it, but there's a certain ego boost to being a panel guest and spending a lot of time with them. I think on the Conan one, I got to do like a 10-minute 2-segment interview with him on the show, but it was just very exciting, and there were newspapers and reviews, and it was very exciting. The special airs. I had a party with some friends at my apartment. We felt great. I celebrated. The next morning, Judd called me and he said, "You're feeling hungover, and you don't drink. You are thinking, I gotta write a next one to get back on the horse and do all the promotion, and it's all so exciting." And he said, none of it is real, and the only thing that really matters is the comedians and the people in your life you share things like last night with, the show business and all that. And Amy Schumer said something almost identical about how it's none of that stuff, the promo and the excitement, none of it is real, and it's fleeting, and just concentrate on what you've built in terms of your relationships and this thing that you love to do. So that was really helpful, because yes, I did feel hungover, and I did feel like, oh, not everybody saw it, or it wasn't that big of a boost to my being recognized on the street. I mean, there are very petty things involved in show business where you're just like, why am I still the second guest on a show and not the first guest, or whatever it is, and it's like it's nonsense and such a waste of time. And also they each said something to the effect of, and if you get on that thing where you have to be on to the next thing and rushing all the time, you'll never get off, and you'll never be satisfied, and it's a misery. And that was really helpful. And so for my next show, I just said I want to do something that's a little bit more than observational humor, like I used to just ever notice and do kind of silly things. I'd like it to have some meaning. I'd like to raise the bar in terms of the degree of difficulty, but I don't have to replicate that. I don't have to have it be on HBO or anything and be big. And I was truly grateful that I threaded the needle with this last one, and sort of I still get messages every day about it. People saying that it helped them, or they rewatched it, or they just showed it to somebody. So I couldn't have written down an outcome that is better, because I don't often ask for all that much in my dreams, but it couldn't have gone better. And I also had these people who were able to, from a higher level, give me perspective on what I was experiencing. And I said this to a friend recently, and I'll say this to you. if I had to make a deal where somebody said you'll never get any more famous or better at comedy, but I will promise you, you will never fall any further, and you'll always make a living. You'll just never get much more famous. You'll still become better as a comedian, but nobody will really notice. I would take that. I would take that exchange in a second, because I feel like this is more than I ever expected, and more than I wanted.
You see, Gary, you really have had a wonderful life.
Zuzu's pedals.
Zuzu's pedals. Oh, well, what's better than that? Well, Gary, you've talked about some real important themes: humility, appreciation, remaining grounded, and work. You know, the work of it all. On a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and that what we can't really comprehend, the cumulative effect of decades, if you stay in, and even if you don't, when you tell yourself you're out and they pull you back in. So yeah, so much of it is, and I think you've articulated this as well, the mystery of it all. You can't plan it, you can't explain so much of it. You kind of are a participant. But being grounded in all the things that you talked about, and maintaining your wellness, playing basketball, reading Kurt Vonnegut, nourishing all the parts of yourself that you're going to bring to the stage, I think are important and show up in your work. So thanks for your example and for your friendship, and just for the perspective that you bring as a human being. It's refreshing and light.
Oh, that's really nice to hear, man. I feel the same way. I've always admired your work, but more importantly, I've always admired your ethic, your ethos, and your personality. And I love you, man.
I love you too, buddy.
Thanks,
okay,
Teddy.
Okay, I'll see you soon, pal. Thank you. Bye-bye.